Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Daniel Mermelstein. I'm an organizer of the Lib Dems for UBI group. So we're organizing events like this one to discuss the benefits of basic income and keep the campaign for a basic income alive and kicking inside the Lib Dems. Now, those of us who believe in basic income do so for a number of reasons, but one of them is that we think that financial precariousness has some pretty terrible consequences for people's physical and mental health. So being poor or being on the edge of poverty is a constant source of stress, and we know how bad stress is for your health. And obviously, it's not only the individuals or the individual who pays the price of the stress and bad health, it's all of us as a society who end up paying too in higher NHS bills, in increased levels of crime, increased levels of domestic violence, absenteeism from work, and more. So giving people a floor of financial security through a basic income is not only a good thing for them, it's a good thing for all of us, right? So that's why we wanted to organize this particular conversation, because here to talk about this is someone who's actually thought long and hard about this, about basic income and health outcomes. It's Professor Matthew Johnson, who is from Northumbria University. And so he's here to basically tell us everything about his research into this topic. So I'm gonna just, without further ado, just hand it over to Matthew and let him get on with it. And we can have. I'm gonna suggest that we let him present, and then maybe make some notes if you have any questions, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of it. So over to you, Matthew.
Thanks very much indeed. Oh, Daniel, it says host disabled, participant screen sharing.
All participants. Okay, have a go at that.
Oh, there we go. Brilliant. Okay. Okay, brilliant. Thanks ever so much, everyone, for inviting me, and Daniel for basically doing my job, which is to present a case for introduction of basic income. And I think the case that you've outlined there, Daniel, is really summarizes the case that I'm going to advance tonight, which is that basic income makes a lot of sense for a number of different reasons. And actually, when we think about the sort of policies that are introduced in Britain, our response is often, well, why on earth did we introduce this manifestly harmful and damaging policy? And we've seen that, I think, in some of the figures on take disability benefits today, and the associated decision of the government to make even greater conditionality a central part of welfare reform over the next year. What that speaks to is the fundamental dysfunction in policy making in this country. And what we have to do, I think, is to get back to Beveridge-style thinking about the way in which we transform our country. And that requires real informed evidence-based policy that secures basically the social determinants of various different outcomes, whether it be health, economic, educational, criminal, or otherwise. And the starting premise for me now is that I'm increasingly drawn to ask, why don't we have a basic income? Because it just makes sense. It makes sense insofar as it satisfies our needs. If it's set at a high enough level, it enables us to satisfy those fundamental human needs that, if not satisfied, leaves us in a condition of permanent ill health or death. It secures us. And we have politicians these days talking about the way in which society is insecure and the need for policies that promote security. But actually, the easiest way to secure people is to secure their financial security by giving them a basic income. For all of these extremely convoluted schemes that politicians dream up these days, that don't address financial insecurity in the way that basic income would do. And they don't address financial insecurity because addressing financial insecurity can only be done by guaranteeing people an income adequate to satisfy their needs. And fundamentally, basic income lets us do the things we want to do. And one of the reasons we're part of society, one of the reasons that we as a species are bound together in order to exist, is that we need other people in order to do various different things that are important to us. And what basic income does is enable us to develop ourselves individually and collectively in order to achieve the various different things that we need to achieve because we value them or because they're fundamentally important. So as a consequence, it helps us individually, as Daniel says, it helps us individually and as a nation. And there are very few policies these days that actually do that. Perhaps the most important point about this in terms of justice is that rich people already have a basic income. And I think it's quite difficult to explain to people the experience of not having a basic income or having a basic income if you haven't already had that financial security running through your life. And I remember when I went to university, I went at a time in which both my parents were on benefits and were subject to various different forms of conditionality. I was living with my grandparents on a council estate at the time, and I went into the open day at Newcastle University and was confronted by a load of people from independent schools who had gone on winter holidays. And the question all I had for me was, where have you been this winter? And my response was, I haven't been anywhere this winter. And thinking about it, I haven't been on holiday, not the holiday that you've all had, ever, frankly. And that experience of understanding that kids from affluent backgrounds have a fundamental form of financial security in the form of inherited wealth, it is really transformative in the way in which you see yourself and your opportunity in society. Rich people just don't understand the degree of financial security they have by virtue of inherited wealth. So this project that we've developed over the last few years has taken on board this idea that basic income is a really good idea, it's a nice idea, and tested to destruction the idea that nobody would vote for it. And the reason that people would vote for it, the reason that people support basic income, is because they recognize the transformative role it has in people's lives. So the health case is really quite clear. If you reduce poverty, that is, if you provide people with a basic income adequate enough to satisfy their basic needs, their health improves. People can feed themselves, they can get better food, they can get better housing, they can afford to heat their houses. At the minute, one of the key problems in social housing is development of black mold and damp and a general diminution in people's living standards by virtue of their inability to heat their houses adequately and to open their windows. Basic income satisfies our basic needs and ensures that we can do all of those things that enable us to live healthily. It also mitigates inequality. And when we think about inequality today, often it's in the abstract sense about the difference between income levels, the difference between the amount of wealth that people have. And that's certainly of importance in this context. But what I think gives clarity and a tangible illustration to the impact of basic income on inequality is the notion of domination. That fundamentally there are environments in the house and in work which are abusive and exploitative, and they're abusive and exploitative precisely because the stronger party knows the weaker party can't leave. An abusive partner can abuse the other partner because they know that the abused partner hasn't got a get out. Employers can treat their staff appallingly when they know that they can't leave. And what basic income does is to give power to every single individual within society to leave, to say no. And in that sense, it's bound up with this notion of freedom as non-domination, the idea that we are only dominated if we are subject to vulnerability that other people can exploit. And one of the things about mitigating inequality is that it reduces stress. So one of the key sources of stress that people face is the threat of destitution. And all of those work and home-based examples of abuse and exploitation are stress-inducing precisely because people know that they can't leave, and if they do leave, they'll be exposed to destitution, which is both socially and psychologically damaging. You know, this invokes existential threats to human life. So if you reduce stress, there's a possibility of reducing what are known as biopsychosocial pathways to ill health, but also transforming people's behavior. People who are stressed are likely to engage in short-termist, hedonistic behavior. They're less likely to be able to do the things that they need to do in order to promote their long-term health. And what we find is that with basic income's predictability and stability of income, people are able to project a much longer lifespan. So they're able to see themselves living for a much longer period of time. And when people think that their lifespan is going to be longer, they invest much more in the long term. They are much less likely to be to engage in hedonistic activity. They're much less likely to binge. They're much more likely to engage in exercise and the sorts of activities that promote long-term health and well-being. So in that regard, this is the perfect multi-purpose policy for our times. So one response from health policymakers, public health policymakers in the UK, is that the relationship between financial security, income, and health is correlated, but the direction can be from money and financial security to health, but also from health to money and financial security. And that, in one sense, is true. There is it's definitely the case that there are elements of bidirectional causality, but the overwhelming evidence that we've looked at suggests that money and financial security really does affect health, certainly mental health in this instance. So what you find, look, these are this is a graph with a breakdown in quintiles among 14 to 24-year-olds in the UK. And you can see, look, there's a clear linear pattern with regard to the rates of anxiety and depression among young people and the relationship there to income. And moreover, what we see is not just a linear relationship, but actually something that we're coming to describe as a cliff edge. So if you look at these four graphs, if you replaced the top right graph with dissatisfaction with income, you'd see four extremely similar graphs. So the first graph is perceived risk of destitution mapped against equivalized annual income, depression on the bottom left, anxiety on the bottom right, and then satisfaction with income. And what we find is that there's a cliff edge, which is about the rate, which is set at about the rate of the minimum income standard, which, when we did this study a couple of years ago, was about £11,000 before housing costs. Above which, if you can just get people over that minimum income standard, all of these different health conditions, alongside well-being and people's satisfaction with life and their income, massively improve. Below that cliff edge, below that desperation threshold, you get these appalling outcomes in health, well-being, satisfaction with the world, and all the rest of it that are actually hugely costly to society. Treating people's ill health is incredibly expensive, and the best way to deal with it, as the government recognises, is through prevention. So how do you prevent things? Well, we suggest there are various different basic income schemes that you can adopt. The ambition, the aspiration long term is to get people to a minimum income standard, which is quite expensive, probably about 15 grand a year now. But if you can get people to scheme 2, which is about 9.5 grand a year, slightly above the UK pension, we think that makes a big dint in getting people towards and over the cliff edge threshold. What do these schemes do in terms of their impact on various different outcomes in society? Well, the first thing to emphasize is that even the least generous scheme massively reduces poverty in the UK. It massively reduces inequality, So you get a substantial reduction of inequality down to below the new Labour years, and the number of people who are subject to means testing is reduced massively alongside that as well. All of these schemes are redistributive. They all redistribute wealth from the richest to the poorest. But what you find with the more generous schemes, scheme 2 and 3, is that you get the vast majority of the population gaining precisely because the concentration of wealth at the top end is so concentrated, so dense, that any redistributive impact on wealth at that top end has the capacity to massively improve people's conditions right the way through society. So then there's a question, well, can we quantify the impact of basic income schemes on public health? And we sort of can. We can do it in a conservative form, and the figures that we've come up with at the minute are extremely conservative. So we suggest that annually you can reduce cases of depressive disorders by between 124,000 and about 1 million, depending on the scheme. You can reduce physical health problems by about 118,000 to about over 1 million, depending on the scheme. You can save the NHS what looks like fairly small sums, and again, this is a conservative estimate, by preventing diseases and preventing things like emergency admissions. If you prevent emergency admissions, you make a massive dent in the public health burden, because emergency admissions are just so expensive to deal with. So the question then is, look, basic income looks extremely expensive, and it is. Each of the schemes, albeit scheme 1 is fiscally neutral using income tax. Schemes 2 and 3 require things like wealth tax in order to fund the upfront cost. The response is that fundamentally there are no cheap means of resolving the various different crises that Britain faces. Just as in 1945, the only means of addressing Britain's crises is through large public investment. You can make a start through fiscally neutral schemes using income tax systems. More expensive schemes can be funded through wealth and land taxes. Certainly the eradication of reliefs and subsidies for which there is very little moral justification. And perhaps most importantly, through massive savings in efficiency and health. And when we think about the overall cost of anxiety and depression, for example, to British society, we're talking about something in the region of 118 billion in the last couple of years being spent on treating those two conditions and dealing with the productivity impacts of those two conditions alone. So this really is an upstream intervention to address social determinants that has the capacity to make a huge impact on the way that our economy, our society functions. And the overarching argument here is that basic income offers much clearer pathways to outcomes than alternatives. We seem to spend the vast majority of our time as a country coming up with piecemeal means of papering over cracks. We introduce local schemes aimed at alleviating various different conditions by bringing people together, giving people artistic exposure and all the rest of it. And that's not to say that these downstream interventions aren't important, but it is to argue that none of those interventions are fundamentally going to deal with the wide range of crises that Britain faces at present. So then the follow-up question is, well, it's a nice idea, but nobody will vote for it. Who on earth would vote for a scheme like this? And we hear this argument repeatedly, particularly from Labour politicians. Labour politicians are wont to suggest that any sort of policy approaching the ambition of beverage-style transformations that Labour introduced in 1945 is politically toxic and unfeasible. But we find no evidence of that. In fact, we find fundamental evidence of the popularity of basic income. So what we find, sorry, the Compass report was launched 6 months ago. I forgot to amend that. What we find is high levels of initial support for basic income, both in proportion of respondents and strength of support among respondents. So we consistently find, wherever we do this in the country, between 68 and 80% approval ratings for basic income, which is much higher than comparable policies. I mean, that is a hugely impressive level of approval for a welfare reform. And what we find alongside that is actually a very small proportion of the population are fundamentally opposed to basic income. So between 7 to 12% of the population is strongly opposed to basic income. But even then, what we find is when you work with those people who are strongly opposed to those policies to develop narratives to persuade others like them to support basic income, that not only does overall support for basic income increase, but also support among people who are fundamentally opposed to basic income increases substantially as well. So even that 7 to 12% of the population that despises basic income, and on average at the outset evaluates it at something like 12-13% approval rating. When you present narratives that people who share those perspectives have shaped and developed, that support level goes up to 50%. So you see this huge increase in levels of support when people are presented with salient information about the impact of basic income on their lives. So there's no reason why politicians can't get people to vote in their own interests. All too often, politicians tell us that it is just not possible to get people to vote in their own interests. And yet what we find time and again is that people have been persuaded to vote against their own interests. What this project, what this research overall has shown is that it's perfectly possible to get people to vote in their own interest. And actually the problem lies in politicians not trying to persuade people to do that. We've lost our ability to use evidence-based policy to persuade people, and it's hugely important that we get back to that. So in terms of advancing the debate on this, I think there is a series of recommendations that we ought to take forward. Policymakers really ought to commit to large trials of basic income, large enough to be population level, to enable us to conduct randomized controlled trials that enable us to understand clear impact over a long period of time. Policymakers should definitely explain the public health and economic impacts of basic income to voters. And they should do that using narratives tailored specifically to people's circumstances. We should definitely do research on effectively and consistently on the impacts that basic income has on people's lives. And we should work with stakeholders to determine formulation of schemes and uphold concern for the interests of participants in pilots. Moreover, policymakers should be confident that basic income is the right policy at the right time. And I think it's that final point that I'd like you to reflect upon. We have a political consensus at the minute that everything doesn't work, nothing works, but no consensus that any change is possible. And I think it's very important for people who are politically engaged to think about the way in which the case for basic income can be made more effectively. And I think one of the key ways that can be done is through the work of people like Julia, Hines, and Daniel in taking forward pilots like the one that's being developed in East Finchley, because that really does have the ability to demonstrate to people that there is a feasible and viable alternative out there. So thanks very much. I'll stop sharing.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That was great. I think what I'll do now, as I said, I will stop the recording and then we can have a Q&A. Where do I stop the recording? Ah, here we go.